Hello, I'm Ilan Shor. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. If you're into political intrigue, hybrid warfare and Russian meddling, buckle up, because today we're talking about Moldova. This small Eastern European state has become Russia's latest playground in its never-ending game of let's make them love us by any means necessary. Much like a geopolitical reality show, but with fewer roses and more shady oligarchs, there are few winners in this story. The main villain today is a billionaire with connections to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov's family. It's like he's circled off every item on the how to be a Russian puppet bingo. So, let's take a look at our report to find out more about the situation before we delve deeper into the details.
Moldova's pro-European government faces a new challenge from its restive pro-Moscow Gagauzia region after its leaders denounced proposed judicial reforms and demanded enhanced status for the Russian language.
We in Moldova know that the Kremlin's expansionist goals stretch beyond Ukraine. Russia's actions to undermine Moldova's democracy are proof of that.
Gagauzia's 140,000 residents, mainly ethnic Turks who adhere to Orthodox Christianity, have had uneasy relations with central authorities since Moldova threw off Soviet rule in 1991. Gagauzia's local assembly has recently rejected judicial reforms, which would shut down an appeal court in the region and called for special status for Russian, alongside Moldova's sole state language, Romanian.
Here, most of the people speak Gagauz and Russian. Because all the documents and even the medical stuff is in Romanian, I wouldn't say they have to, they started to be interested in Romanian.
Moldova, one of Europe's poorest countries, has a Romanian-speaking majority and a substantial Russian-speaking minority, and its politics have oscillated between pro-Western and pro-Russian parties for decades. Tensions surrounding Gagauzia are yet another instance of the intricate play surrounding the fate of the country.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. And let's start with some context here. Moldova, which is sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania, has been doing its best to distance itself from the Russian sphere of influence and cozy up to the European Union. But Russia, being Russia, doesn't exactly take rejection well. So what does it do? It throws a tantrum, sending money, support and offering propaganda opportunities to pro-Russian political parties in Moldova, because obviously that's the adult way to deal with things, right? Enter Ilan Shor, the Moldovan tycoon who's basically Russia's new best friend in the region. He has recently launched a political bloc in Moscow with 5 other Russophile parties. And they called it the Pobeda, which means victory in Russia, because nothing says we're totally innocent like a name that sounds like a Soviet-era propaganda film. So this new bloc aims to unseat Moldova's Western-oriented leadership and bring the country back into Russia's loving embrace. You know, the same Ruski mirror that involves a lot of lies and the occasional invasion. Shor's key objectives are as straightforward as they come. He wants to stop Moldova from joining the European Union, push for closer ties with Russia and unseat President Maia Sandu. The Moldovan authorities have previously deregistered Shor's party and are filing criminal charges against anyone who smells like Russian money. Shor and his allies, meanwhile, are hosting anti-government protests, smuggling in cash and even creating deep-fake videos of Moldovan politicians. Because if you can't win at politics, you might as well go full James Bond villain. But here is the thing about Russian meddling. It's never just one thing. Russia's been busy in other parts of Moldova too. Take the Gagauzia autonomous region, for example. The governor, Evgenia Gutsul, is so pro-Russian that she might as well have a Putin tattoo on her forehead. She's accused of campaign finance violations, and the Moldovan authorities are cracking down on her activities. Russia loves a good hybrid operation, and it's clear that they are using pro-Russian actors in Moldova to destabilize and degrade Moldovan democracy. And let's not forget about Transnistria, the Russian-backed breakaway republic in Moldova. Russian peacekeeping forces have been conducting training exercises without notifying the Moldovan authorities, which is a big no-no. It is almost as if they are trying to create tension and unease in Moldova. Oh wait, that's exactly what they're doing, right? So where does this leave Moldova? In a precarious position, to say the least. The Moldovan government is doing its best to combat Russian hybrid operations, but it's like playing whack-a-mole with a particularly slippery mole that has a lot of money and a lot of influence. The European Union and NATO are watching, where Russia seems determined to keep Moldova in its orbit, whether they like it or not. Now, if you think the situation in Moldova is complicated, wait till you've heard the rest, because we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg. So let's begin with the political situation there. We've already mentioned Ilan Shor and the way that he is trying to, well, shore up the support of Moscow and its influence in Moldova. But it is the way in which he's doing that which is particularly interesting. Now, Shor's party itself has been banned in Moldova, and Ilan Shor was forced to essentially relocate to the country of his birth, which is Israel. However, he also frequently travels to Moscow, and it is there that he's chosen to set the stage for the next part of his Odyssey. So the Odyssey in question is about unifying the forces that are willing to go along with him and to spread Russian influence all across Moldova. Now, the Shor party itself has been banned, but it is, at least technically, a part of this alliance. The name of the alliance is quite telling. It's Pobeda, as we've already mentioned, victory. This also used to be a name of one of the first post-war Russian cars, but we don't really care about that. Victory it is. Although, whether it's going to be a victory for Ilan Shor, well, it is still open to debate. Now, it is when we are thinking about the rest of that it is getting interesting. So, in Moscow, these parties are coming together. Apart from Shor's own party, it also features another one called Chances. Perhaps it's about taking chances, I don't know. But it also features yet another one known as the Renaissance. A fancy name indeed, but these parties and two others, which, according to a recent article about them, were too small to even be featured in nationwide polls in Moldova, but they are there, trust me. They are, or might be, intended as this sort of backup system. So if one party gets banned in Moldova, another one steps in, but essentially serves as the avatar of the previous one. Complicated? Well, it is, but it might also be effective, unless the Moldovan authorities decide enough is enough. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, Ilan Shor is not the only guy who's rooting for Moscow. We also got another one, Igor Dodon. You might remember him. He was actually the rival to Maia Sandu in presidential elections, but he lost, and since then he got a bit sidelined. Apparently, Moscow doesn't care for also rants. They have transferred all their loving tender care to Ilan Shor, leaving him marooned on the political scene, but still willing to please and willing to fight for the Kremlin's influence in Moldova. Now, in the near future, there might at least be an opportunity for all these forces to come together, sit down, and talk about at least some sort of grudging respect for one another, if not outright unification. You see, the socialists and the communists have accused Ilan Shor of poaching their activists and essentially taking away their influence. They don't want to become dissolved in Ilan Shor's grand plan. They want to retain some sort of autonomy, naturally. But they are all playing on the same side, right? They are all playing the Kremlin's game. So perhaps at some point there might be a risk that all these anti-European forces will, in some way at least, come together and challenge the existing political establishment. Now, this is not the only problem that Maia Sandu and her pro-European camp is facing, because we've also got Gagauzia. Now, you might not be aware of that particular region. When you're thinking about Moldova, you often think, Transnistria. However, this is not the only part of Moldova which is a bit problematic. Let's take a glance at the map to see what this is all about. You see, Transnistria marked in red, now this is familiar. Controlled by Russia, Russian so-called peacekeepers are in place there. So this is not something that you will be surprised by. But how about the region marked in white, Gagauzia? Well, that is an entirely different story. You see, this region, at one point in the past was actually striving for independence. They actually declared that, but they were reincorporated into Moldova a few years later. Now, they are inhabited mostly by people of Turkic origins, but they are also Orthodox Christians. You see, when you're thinking about, say, Ukraine, you know that the Russian Orthodox Church has been the perfect vehicle for the Kremlin's propaganda. And it is also here that we've got a similar mechanism at work. So these people might be Turkic in origin, but they are more than willing to use the Russian language, so much so that they recently protested an educational reform which was supposed to, well, make it less likely for people to focus on the Russian language, more likely to focus on the Romanian language. So they want more rights for the Russian speakers. And when you hear Russian speakers, doesn't this ring a bell? Of course it does. In fact, there is a risk that Russia might be preparing ground for a future potential intervention in Moldova. And when the Russian propaganda mentions Russian speakers, you know that this scenario has already played out in Ukraine and ended up in the war that is still ongoing and still showing no signs of abating. So of course, Moldova right now is more difficult to reach because, well, Russia is still bogged down in the Donbass, and it's still far away from actually, punching a corridor through, including capturing Odessa. But if it did, Moldova's situation would have been very precarious indeed. So we've already established that Gagauzia is under what we might refer to as Russian influence. In fact, this Russian influence did not come about by way of invasion, incursion, even hybrid warfare, at least not in the strict sense. Instead, through information influence, they actually have managed to gain control through local elections. And now, the name to watch here is Evgenia Gutsul. Evgenia Gutsul might not be a household name, at least not yet, but people are watching this character very closely. Relatively young, a member of Ilan Shor's party, obviously, or at least one of these parties, if you care to keep track of that, which are legal, which are not. This is going to be fluctuating, so we're actually imposing or placing this caveat here just in case one party disappears, another is formed. After all, it is all about the Pobeda, right? And also the Ruski Mir. What matters most here is that they're all hell-bent on extending the Kremlin's influence. And Gagauzia might actually be the perfect spot for that. It is also because, well, Transnistria is becoming slightly less convenient for Moscow as the time goes by. Why is that so? Well, again, looking at the map, it might not be immediately obvious, but we need to go deeper to understand what's going on there and what Moldova could do, but it is a bit afraid of actually doing so. In a nutshell, Moldova could actually disconnect the energy system that has sustained this whole scenario for a very long time. In short, Transnistria benefited, and it still does benefit, from Russian energy, which it buys at a discount price. And of course, the problem is that if you disconnect this, and also if you disconnect gas deliveries, you've still got the population there, which is not only partially pro-Russian, it's also quite numerous. Moldova is not exactly a wealthy country. So when I said Moldova could do things, but might not be willing to, or might not have the courage to, well, that's exactly what I meant. Moldova knows very well indeed that if it decides to make this whole energy system independent from Russia, it is still going to be forced to sustain the population there, 300,000 people, right? That would be no small feat. So it might be holding the key to a future solution at least. It would face a renewed amount of Russian propaganda, an absolute avalanche of Russian hybrid warfare, and also a huge amount of expenditure on its hand. It would be no small feat, but the European Union might be willing to help, at least at some point. The question is naturally whether the Sandu government will be able to hold on that long, because as we've already seen, there might be danger lurking just around the corner in the form of an alliance of pro-Russian forces which are not likely to simply give up and say, okay, go to the European Union, then good riddance, we don't care. Russia is a very poor loser, and it is not likely to simply say that this is over, and we've got nothing else to talk about. And now we're moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has accused China of attempting to influence the upcoming 2024 US presidential elections. These allegations come despite a previous statement from Chinese President Xi Jinping saying that China would not engage in such activities.
Blinken's accusation was made public following the three-day diplomatic visit to China, where he met with top Chinese officials, including President Xi. The US has expressed strong disapproval of China's actions, with Blinken reiterating President Joe Biden's message to Xi during their San Francisco summit last November to refrain from interfering in US elections, to which Xi reportedly agreed. During the visit, Blinken also raised concerns about China's support for Russia's defense industry, warning that continued assistance could lead to further US action beyond existing sanctions imposed on over 100 Chinese entities and individuals. An anonymous US official reported that China has been supplying Russia with essential materials for military equipment production. This includes components for cruise missiles, drones, and optics used in tanks and armored vehicles. The official suggested that without these supplies, Russia's military efforts would face significant challenges.
Turkey is currently in negotiations with American energy titan ExxonMobil for a substantial liquefied natural gas agreement, potentially worth billions. Turkish Energy Minister announced the ongoing negotiations and highlighted the country's intent to diversify its energy sources and lessen dependence on Russia.
The proposed deal could see Turkey receiving up to 2.5 million tons of LNG annually over the next decade, a volume that would account for about 7% of the nation's gas consumption based on 2022 figures. While the financial specifics are still being ironed out, Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar noted that at present rates, this quantity of LNG would cost his country more than $1 billion. This initiative comes as Turkey prepares for an expiration of key contracts with its primary gas provider, Russia, in 2025, and with Iran the following year. Turkey's commitment to energy diversification is evident in its infrastructure investments, increasing LNG's share from 15% in 2014 to 30% in 2022. The nation is also actively exploring domestic energy reserves, including a significant gas field in the Black Sea and oil exploration in the southeast.
Tajikistan is urging its citizens not to travel to Russia. The advisory comes amidst reports of increased scrutiny and xenophobic sentiment towards Central Asians in Russia following the terrorist attack on Crocus City Hall near Moscow last month.
The attack on the music hall near Moscow has been described as Russia's most devastating terrorist incident in the last 2 decades. In response, Russian authorities have detained 11 Tajik citizens and a Kyrgyzstan-born Russian citizen, with allegation of severe mistreatment and torture of the detainees emerging. Human rights organizations and Tajik officials have noted a worrying rising xenophobia against Central Asians in the country. The Tajik Foreign Ministry has even issued a temporary travel advisory urging its citizens to avoid travel to Russia. The situation presents a complex challenge for Tajikistan, as the country relies heavily on remittances from its migrant laborers in Russia, which constitute about a third of its GDP. In 2023 alone, over 650,000 Tajiks traveled to Russia for employment, primarily in the construction and agricultural sectors.
Armenian protesters have taken to the streets blocking major highways in opposition to the government's controversial decision to cede border territories to Azerbaijan. Residents of the territories in question, mostly farmers, fear that the decision could deprive them of their livelihood.
The two major highways vital for connecting various regions of Armenia were closed off by demonstrators, causing widespread disruption. The protests, which began in the Tavush province, have been fueled by fears that the border delimitation agreement with Azerbaijan will compromise Armenia's territorial integrity and leave residents without access to their farmlands. The agreement entails the transfer of control of 4 villages and surrounding areas, historically populated by Azerbaijanis during the Soviet era, but under Armenian control since 1990s. While the deal has received international support from the United States and the European Union and has been defended by Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, it has also faced fierce criticism from opposition leaders and concerned citizens. The situation remains tense as the Armenian government grapples with the public's outcry and the strategic implications of the border adjustments. The recent developments mark a critical juncture in the long-standing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, particularly over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which has seen two wars fought over its control in the past 30 years.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.